The forest was vast and unforgiving, a world brimming with towering trees, dense undergrowth, and the murmurs of unseen creatures shifting in the shadows. Somewhere within this boundless wilderness, a small bear cub roamed alone, its tiny paws pressed into the damp earth with each uncertain step. It had once known warmth, safety, and the soft brush of its mother's fur, but those times had vanished. The cub didn't grasp why she was gone, or why it had been abandoned to face a world so much larger and harsher than it had ever imagined. Hunger clawed at the cub's stomach, a strange and persistent ache that drove it onward. It sniffed the ground, searching for anything that hinted at food. Occasionally, it stumbled upon berries scattered among the bushes, but its inexperience showed in its hesitation, unsure of what was safe to eat. Too young to hunt, too small to confront the creatures that roamed these lands, and too weak to protect itself if danger struck, the cub was alone. A fragile life in a realm where survival favored the strong. The wind carried whispers of movement through the trees, rustling leaves in a way that made the cub pause and listen. Its ears twitched at every sound, every sharp crack of a twig in the distance. The forest was never quiet, and the cub hadn't yet learned which noises promised safety and which warned of predators lurking nearby. All it could do was stay vigilant and move carefully, though it had no true sense of direction. Every step felt like a gamble between life and death, yet it had no option but to press forward. As daylight waned, the air grew colder, sending a shiver through the cub's thin fur. It had once nestled against its mother's warmth each night, but now it faced only the biting embrace of the wind. Curling up beneath a fallen tree, it hoped the thick trunk would shield it from the night's worst chill. Darkness stretched on, filled with eerie sounds that made the cub tremble. A distant wolf's howl reverberated through the trees, a stark reminder that it wasn't alone in this place. It pressed its body tighter against the rough bark, willing itself to vanish, to become just a shadow in the undergrowth. The night dragged on, but morning eventually broke, bringing light that filtered through the leaves in golden streaks. The cub stretched its stiff limbs, shaking off sleep's rigidity, and resumed its quest for food. The scent of water drew it to a small stream, where it lapped at the cool liquid. Hunger lingered, but for a moment, the water offered relief. A shadow swept overhead, and the cub glanced up, watching a bird glide across the sky. It had no reason to fear it, not yet. With renewed energy, it clambered over fallen branches, its small claws gripping the rough wood. Each movement was a struggle, but instinct urged it forward. It needed food before weakness overtook it. Unaware of the unseen dangers, the predators that wouldn't hesitate to strike, the cub didn't realize how fragile its existence had become. A sharp sound in the distance halted it. Not the deep growl of a wolf or the heavy tread of a bear, but something else. A high-pitched call echoing through the trees, followed by another, then another. The cub didn't yet understand these cries, nor did it notice the dark shapes gathering on the branches above. The birds sat still, watching, waiting, their eyes glinting with intelligence, their sharp beaks clicking softly as if whispering to one another. The cub pressed on, oblivious to the figures now shadowing its path. The crows had taken notice. They'd spotted the small, helpless creature stumbling through the forest and recognized what it meant. A vulnerable animal was an opportunity. In the wild, no weakness went unseen for long. The cub was being watched, but it had no inkling that its fight for survival was just beginning. The forest sprawled endlessly, a labyrinth of towering trees and tangled undergrowth hiding both life and peril. The cub, still ignorant of the world's harsh truths, staggered forward with slow, unsteady steps. The air carried a damp scent of earth and moss, mingled with something unfamiliar. A faint rustling sounded from above, followed by a piercing call that shattered the morning stillness. The cub lifted its head, blinking at the sky, but the sun's glare blurred the dark shapes moving overhead. It didn't know it was being observed. The crows had gathered silently, perched on high branches, their keen eyes fixed on the small figure below. Patient and observant, they recognized weakness. The cub's sluggish pace, its thin frame, its hesitant steps. Alone, unprotected, and too young to grasp the wild's cruel laws. It was a perfect target. One by one, the crows descended, landing on lower branches for a closer look. Their feathers gleamed like ink, their beady eyes sharp and calculating. Not mere scavengers, they were clever, coordinated, capable of teamwork when it suited them. The cub, unaware of their intent, pressed its nose to the ground, seeking food. It found a cluster of berries nestled against a tree's roots and pawed at them clumsily, crushing some beneath its tiny claws. The first crow dropped down, landing just feet away. It stood still at first, watching, waiting, before letting out a slow, deliberate call. The sound made the cub's ears twitch, but it didn't look up. More crows followed, hopping closer, their sharp beaks clicking as they formed a loose, shifting circle around it. The air buzzed with the beat of wings, a steady rhythm that should have warned the cub. It finally raised its head, its dark eyes meeting the unblinking stares of the birds surrounding it. Confusion flickered in its gaze, not yet fear. It had never met creatures like these and didn't grasp the danger in their numbers. It sniffed the air, taking a cautious step forward, but the moment it moved, a crow spread its wings wide and unleashed a harsh, echoing cry. More joined in, their calls overlapping into an eerie, taunting chorus. The cub flinched, startled by the sudden noise, and stepped back. The crows didn't close in yet. They watched, letting their presence weigh on it like an invisible force. The cub let out a small, uncertain whimper that barely carried beyond the circle of birds. It didn't know what to do. These creatures weren't like the wolves it had smelled at night or the large predators it instinctively avoided. They were smaller, quieter, but their presence felt just as menacing. Then, without warning, a crow moved. A sudden flap of wings, a sharp dive toward the cub's back. The cub spun, startled, but before it could react, another swooped in, then a third, a fourth, each darting in quick, taunting bursts. The cub swiped at the air, but its movements were slow, untrained. The crows knew this. They had patience, and they were only starting. The cub stumbled back, its small paws pressing into the damp forest floor as the birds closed in. The air grew heavy with flapping wings and sharp cries echoing through the trees. The crows grew bolder, testing their edge. Their dark forms shifted, moving in swift bursts. The cub's breathing turned shallow, its heart pounding against its fragile ribs. It didn't understand why they were doing this, only that something was wrong. A crow darted forward, its beak snapping. The cub recoiled as pain flared across its shoulder where the bird struck. The wound was shallow, just a scratch, but it jolted the cub, awakening a buried fear. It let out a small, helpless cry, a sound that should have summoned its mother, but no one came. The crows responded with a flurry of motion. More swept down, their beaks striking, claws brushing its fur. The attacks were quick, precise, never lingering long enough for the cub to fight back. They were toying with it, testing its limits. The cub twisted, trying to shake them off, but there were too many. Their black forms blurred, circling like shadows against the bright morning sky. Desperation surged in its tiny body. It swiped with weak claws, letting out a soft growl that lacked strength. The crows didn't flinch. They'd seen larger, tougher creatures fall. They knew how the wild worked, how life and death turned in an instant, and they exploited weakness. The cub turned to run, but the crows swarmed. A dozen dark bodies descended, wings beating wildly as they struck from all sides. Their beaks found the softest spots, where its fur was thin, its flesh unprotected. The pain was sharp, searing, each new wound burning worse than the last. The cub cried out again, louder, raw, and breaking. It stumbled, legs shaking, vision blurring as fear took hold. The world spun, a chaos of black feathers and sharp pain. The crows didn't relent, moving in a ruthless rhythm, each strike pushing the cub closer to collapse. It fell, its body hitting the ground with a soft thud, breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The crows paused, hovering just above, watching. Their dark eyes gleamed with something unreadable, ancient, knowing. They'd seen this before, watched the fight drain from a creature until only the final struggle remained. The cub trembled, trying to rise, but its limbs felt heavy, too weak to move. Could still hear them, the crows shifting, waiting. The morning sun burned against its fur, but the warmth didn't reach beneath its skin. The forest had gone quiet, even the wind stilling. For the first time since it was abandoned, the cub felt true helplessness. Its body shook as it lay in the dirt, each shallow breath a reminder of its powerlessness. The crows perched on low branches, their dark feathers blending into the shadows, waiting, their patience unbroken. They'd seen its struggle weaken and knew the end was near. One crow let out a slow, deliberate call, slicing through the silence. A signal. The others answered, a chorus of sharp cries ringing through the trees. Then, as if unleashed, they moved all at once. A storm of black wings filled the air, beaks and claws descending without hesitation. The cub cried out, twisting in the dirt, but its movements were sluggish, its energy spent. It tried to stand, but the crows were relentless, their beaks like tiny daggers digging into its soft skin, tugging at its fur. Each bite sent fresh pain racing through its body. It swiped weakly, but its strikes hit nothing. The birds were too fast, too skilled. Its vision blurred. It felt the warmth of its own blood seeping through its fur, heard the crow's wings beating so close the wind brushed its face. Their cries rang in its ears, a mix of hunger and cruel delight. Then one crow shifted tactics. Instead of pecking its back or legs, it lunged for the cub's face, aiming for its eye. The cub flinched just in time, jerking its head away, but the strike grazed below its eye, leaving a thin, stinging cut. The pain was sharper, deeper, sparking a fear unlike any before. Another crow followed, then another. They weren't just testing now, they were aiming to end it. The cub let out a desperate, terror-filled cry. It didn't expect anyone to hear. It had never known a world where help came. It hadn't learned what it meant to be saved. But something did hear. A deep, heavy sound rumbled through the trees, low, like distant thunder, but with a force that made the ground tremble. The crows heard it too, their movements pausing for a split second, heads snapping toward the source. Before the cub could lift its head, the forest shifted. The earth shook with the weight of something massive charging through, branches snapping, bushes rustling violently. The air filled with a guttural roar, something powerful and alive. The crows hesitated, their instincts screaming danger. For the first time, they didn't attack. Then, in an instant, the air erupted. A massive shape burst through the undergrowth, moving faster than its size should allow. The crows shrieked in alarm, scattering into the air in a chaotic flurry. The cub barely had strength to look up, but when it did, a towering form loomed above. A creature far larger than itself, its presence overwhelming, its breath primal. The crows had miscalculated, and now something stronger had arrived. The ground vibrated beneath the cub's trembling body as the massive creature stood over it. The scent of earth and musk flooded the air, thick and overpowering, mingling with the deep, guttural breaths of the newcomer. The cub blinked slowly, its vision hazy from exhaustion, struggling to comprehend what had happened. The crow's sharp cries faded, replaced by an eerie silence as the forest held its breath. The figure above was unmistakably a bear. Not like the cub, but enormous, its fur wild and streaked with scars from past battles. Its dark eyes gleamed with something ancient and fierce, its powerful frame tense as it surveyed the scene. The crows had fled to the treetops, their black forms darting through the sky like scattered shadows. They hadn't gone far, perching silently, watching, uncertain of what would follow. The cub didn't move. It didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. Instinct told it bears could be protectors or threats. This one was unlike any it had known, its presence suffocating, like a storm about to break. The larger bear exhaled, its breath warm and heavy, then lowered its head toward the cub. The cub flinched but couldn't flee. Its strength was gone. The bear's nose brushed its fur, sniffing, searching for something unseen. The moment stretched, tense and uncertain, until the bear let out a deep sound, part growl, part sigh. The cub didn't understand, but the air shifted. The larger bear turned its massive head, glancing at the branches where the crows sat. The birds stayed still, their dark eyes fixed on the predator that had claimed their prize. Then, without warning, the bear rose onto its hind legs, towering above the trees, and unleashed a roar that shattered the silence like thunder. The force rippled through the air, shaking leaves from branches, making the forest quiver. The crows didn't hesitate this time. They burst into the sky, their cries drowned by the roar's raw power. The cub squeezed its eyes shut, curling into itself as the sound overwhelmed it. A force so intense it felt like the air had torn apart. When the roar faded, silence reclaimed the forest. The cub slowly opened its eyes. The larger bear had dropped back to all fours, its gaze fixed on the sky where the crows had vanished. Only then did it turn back to the cub. The moment lingered, heavy with something neither fully grasped. The cub should have been afraid, should have fled, but it didn't. It stayed, and the larger bear didn't leave. The forest settled into an uneasy quiet, the echo of the roar lingering like an unspoken warning. The cub remained where it had fallen, its small body curled tight as if to disappear. The larger bear's heavy scent enveloped it, overpowering all else. Instinct screamed to run, but exhaustion pinned it in place, the ache of the crow's attacks pulsing beneath its fur. The larger bear didn't leave. Its dark eyes studied the cub, the unsteady rise and fall of its ribs, the faint twitch of its paws as it tried to stand. Something in the cub's broken movements spoke to the older bear. This was no chance encounter, but a life teetering on the edge. The wind shifted, rustling leaves overhead, but the crows didn't return. They lingered at a distance, watching, waiting for the balance to shift. They wouldn't approach while the larger bear remained. The cub tried to rise, its legs trembling violently, barely holding its weight. The world tilted, unsteady. It had never felt this weak, the thought of surviving another night alone crushing it. The larger bear didn't look away. It lowered its head again, nudging the cub's side with its nose. The cub flinched, expecting pain, but there was none, just a firm touch. The bear pulled back, watching, then nudged harder. The cub swayed but stayed upright. Something flickered in the bear's expression, unreadable yet decisive. It exhaled deeply, a slow breath carrying finality, then turned and began walking away, its enormous paws pressing into the earth. The cub watched, blinking in confusion. It didn't understand why the bear had saved it, why it hadn't attacked, why it had stayed. Then the bear stopped. It didn't turn or look back, but it didn't leave either. It waited. The cub hesitated, its body aching, torn apart, yet something stirred within, small, fragile, unbroken. It didn't know why, but it took a step forward, then another. Its movements were slow, faltering, but it followed. The larger bear didn't move until the cub reached its side. Only then did it resume walking, its massive form vanishing into the forest. The cub trailed behind, leaving the clearing empty. The crows, hidden among the trees, watched in silence. The weak had survived, but the wild was unforgiving, and the cub's true test was just beginning. The forest stretched endlessly before them, towering trees casting long shadows across the uneven ground. The larger bear moved with quiet purpose, weaving through the undergrowth effortlessly. The cub, struggling, followed as best it could. Each step grew heavier, its body still sore from the crow's relentless assault, its fur ruffled and dotted with cuts. But there was no time to rest. The larger bear didn't slow, and an instinct deep within urged the cub to keep going. The ground was damp from recent rains, softened mud bearing faint imprints of their paws, the cubs barely visible beside the deep, firm tracks of its guide. The contrast was stark. One a predator in its prime, the other a frail creature clinging to life. Yet the larger bear allowed the cub to follow. The cub didn't know why. The wind carried distant sounds, swaying branches, the murmur of water, the occasional cry of a bird. But the crows stayed away, their hunger stalled by the unexpected protector. Time blurred as the cub's limbs grew heavy, its pace slowing, its body begging for rest. Still, it followed, drawn by the bear's presence, a silent force overriding its exhaustion. The path led to a clearing where the land sloped toward a shallow river, its water shimmering in the fading light as evening approached. The larger bear moved to the edge, lowering its head to drink, its massive body steady. The cub hesitated at the water's edge. It had never seen such a wide stretch before. Its mother had shown it smaller pools, but this was new, the rippling surface and unfamiliar sound holding it back. Thirst burned its throat, but caution rooted its paws. The larger bear lifted its head, water dripping from its fur. It didn't look at the cub directly but didn't move away either, just waited. The cub took a tentative step, then another until its paws touched the cool mud. Its reflection wavered in the water, wide eyes, matted fur. Slowly, it lapped at the surface, its dry tongue soaking in long-needed relief. The larger bear turned, walking to a patch of soft earth near the trees, and settled down with practiced ease. The cub watched, uncertain. It had never slept without fear pressing on its chest, never rested without dread of an attack. But something about the bear's presence felt different. The cub took shaky steps forward before its tired legs gave out. It curled into itself, wounds making every move slow and careful. The larger bear didn't react, didn't acknowledge it, yet the space between them felt less vast. The wind shifted, rustling the trees, carrying distant calls of unseen creatures. Night loomed, and the forest would awaken with sounds that had haunted the cub since it was left alone. But for the first time, the fear was quieter. The crows were gone, and it wasn't alone. Darkness fell, the air turning crisp. The cub curled tighter, its thin fur barely shielding the chill. Exhaustion overwhelmed it, but sleep came fitfully. The forest sounds, wolf howls, rustling undergrowth, stirring unease. Yet this night was different. The larger bear lay nearby, its massive form still except for the slow rise of its chest, a presence unlike any the cub had known. Its scent was strong, earthy, steeped in the wild. The cub had once known a mother's warmth, but that memory was fading. Alone so long, companionship felt alien. It shivered not just from cold, but from uncertainty. It didn't know if the bear would let it stay, if this was temporary mercy in a cruel world. Perhaps by morning, the bear would leave, abandoning the cub to its struggle. The thought weighed heavy, but sleep finally took hold, dulling the ache, quieting the night's hum. Morning arrived with soft golden light filtering through the canopy. The cub stirred, stiff from the cold, but the larger bear was still there, its dark eyes open, watching with unreadable intent. No hostility, no sign of rejection. The cub rose on shaky legs, hunger gnawing anew, a reminder of survival's uncertainty. The larger bear seemed to sense this. Without warning, it stood, its massive frame rising effortlessly, and began walking. The cub hesitated. It wasn't being abandoned, but the bear didn't pause to acknowledge it either. Something inside urged it to follow. Step by step, it trailed behind as the path led deeper into the forest, where trees soared and undergrowth thickened. A rich, unfamiliar scent wafted through the air. The cub's nose twitched food. The larger bear led them to a fallen tree, its roots torn from the earth, revealing dirt teeming with insects. With a powerful swipe, the bear scattered bark, exposing wriggling grubs, a small but vital meal. The cub watched, hesitant, as the bear scooped them up with ease. It had never eaten this way, never been shown how to find food in hidden places. Hunger overpowered doubt. The cub crept forward, mimicking the bear's movements, its small claws scraping the dirt awkwardly. It was slow, clumsy, but it learned. The larger bear didn't interfere, didn't offer food or push it away, just worked methodically. The cub struggled but grew bolder with each small success. For the first time since it was left alone, it wasn't just surviving, it was being taught. The day passed in steady silence. The cub followed, observing the bear's every move. How it sniffed the air, stepped carefully through foliage, paused to listen. These were lessons it had been too young to learn before abandonment. The sun dipped low when they stopped, The cub's belly was fuller than it had been in days, its body steadier. The larger bear lay down, stretching as if this were routine. The cub stood, uncertain. It had never been given a place before. As night deepened and the forest whispered anew, the cub didn't feel fear creep in. It didn't feel like prey awaiting the end. It was still small, still weak, still learning, but it wasn't alone. Days passed in survival's rhythm. The cub followed, learning silently, watching every instinct-driven choice. It no longer wandered aimlessly through a vast, dangerous world. Each step had purpose. It began to grasp the forest's patterns. Hidden food sources, the wind's hints of prey and predators. It wasn't just surviving, it was growing. The larger bear remained a quiet, steady presence. Never coddling, never slowing, but never leaving. It accepted the cub without question, as if it had always been there. The cub learned to follow without hesitation, an unspoken bond forming. Its thin frame filled with muscle, its coat thickened, its steps grew confident. The timid creature left to fend for itself was fading, replaced by something stronger. Fear still flickered at times, but it didn't linger. One evening, as the sun sank, painting the sky orange and blue, the larger bear stopped on a high ridge overlooking the vast forest. The cub stood beside it, gazing at the world it once feared, the same world that nearly broke it. But it was different now, not helpless, not alone. The wind carried distant crow calls, faint and far, but the cub didn't flinch. It had faced them and survived. The wild had tested it, nearly consumed it, but it endured. It had found a guide, a guardian, a place in a world that should have forgotten it. As stars scattered like embers in the darkening sky, the cub lay beside the larger bear. Night sounds no longer threatened. The unknown no longer loomed. It wasn't the journey's end. The wild would always be dangerous, and the cub would keep learning, keep fighting. But now it had a chance, and sometimes a chance was enough. Nature is brutal, yet it holds unexpected mercy. In the darkest times, survival often hinges on those who stand by us, guiding us when we're lost. Just like this little cub found hope in the unlikeliest place. Second chances await those who keep moving forward. If you enjoyed this tale of resilience and survival in nature's untamed beauty, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss a tale that leaves you speechless. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.